This video focuses on combining functions using algebra of the functions and then specifying their domains. So go ahead and just pause and read. All right, we're going to do 4 operations in this lesson and then in your assignment. We're going to add 2 functions together. We're going to subtract 2 functions. We're going to multiply 2 functions and then divide 2 functions. We do, when we finish the operations, we need to make sure we have the appropriate domain within the functions. So we move on to the first example. So here are 2 functions, f of x, 2x minus 1, that's a linear function. So this one's linear. And then g of x is x squared plus x minus 2, which is a quadratic function. When we graph that out, we get a shape of a parabola. And we're going to go ahead and do these 4 operations. We're going to add them, subtract them, multiply, and divide. And we need to be very careful that we have the appropriate domain when we're done. So I'm just going to go ahead and show each step. And these are in your notes already, so more kind of like listening. If you'd like to write, you can do so, but I know some of you use my scripted notes. So part A, we want to add these 2 functions together. So we're going to take this function and add it to this function. So when we simplify, we get a quadratic function in standard form. Now think about the domain of the function when we're done. Do we see any restrictions on its domain? Is there a fraction? No. Is there a radical? No. So what would be the domain for this function is all real numbers. Okay? All right, subtracting the 2 functions. So when we subtract the 2 functions, we're going to take, so clear this out, we're going to take f of x minus g of x. So here's f of x minus g of x. Be careful, we do need to distribute that negative through to simplify, and we get another quadratic function in standard form. Do we have any domain restrictions? No, we don't have any fraction going on. We don't have any radicals going on. So the domain of this function when we're done, again, would be all real numbers. And you'll see this more in the next example when we get into the domain restrictions. All right, part C. Now we're going to go ahead and multiply the 2 functions together. F of x times g of x. So we see we have our binomial times our trinomial, and we have to distribute everything in the first term to everything in the second. So when you multiply, you're going to end up with 6 terms when you distribute. And lots of work there, and then when we're all done, here is our cubic function when we're all done. So we do some manipulation, get it in standard form. All right, D. D, we're going to go ahead and divide the 2 functions. So we divide. Here is our f of x function. Here is our g of x function. All right. Now let's go into the fun part, talking about the domain of each of these functions. When we talk about the domain of the first 3, all real numbers work. It's the last one that has some problems. If I head back to this last piece, go ahead and clean this up. If I say 2x minus 1, and then I factor this denominator using my t-chart, what are the factors of negative 2 that add to negative 1? Will be positive 2 and negative 1. What we have here is a rational function. And we've done some work already with restriction domains with rational functions. If I substitute a negative 2 into here, or if I substitute a positive 1 into here, that would make each of those parentheses a 0. So we do have some domain restrictions. Okay? And that's what's leading us into that next slide. X could not be negative 2, and x could not be 1. If we do either one of those, it's going to make this denominator a 0, which makes it undefined. So the first 3 parts, the domain here is all real numbers, no restrictions. Part B, again, we end up with a parabola. The domain of this is all real numbers. C, we got a cubic, a snake. No restrictions there, all real numbers. The domain is good. It's part D, and that's leading us into the next slide. we have a domain restriction when we put a -2 into here and we put a 1 in. And that is where I'd like you to go ahead and pause if you'd like to read this. They went through and showed the factoring, x being -2 and x being 1. So there are two numbers we need to exclude when we divide these two functions. And so you can write it like this, -infinity to -2, or -2 to 1, or 1 to infinity. That's how your textbook's going to write it. We're used to in Algebra 2 just saying the domain restriction is x cannot be -2 and x cannot be 1. But this is a little more proper math to write it in this notation. We just change colors as such. That is our domain restriction when we divide the two functions. So our domain would be from -infinity to -2, or -2 to 1, or from 1 to infinity.